There is a rhythm to the escalation of great power rivalries that historians recognize long after the fact and that policymakers almost never recognize in the moment. It is the rhythm of accumulated grievance meeting accumulated capability, of strategic patience exhausted by the one provocation too many, of institutional momentum carrying two adversaries past the threshold of managed competition into the territory of genuine confrontation before either side has made the explicit decision to go there. Students of 1914 know this rhythm. Students of the Cuban Missile Crisis know it. And anyone paying honest attention to the Persian Gulf right now can hear it. In the frequency of Iranian naval incidents, in the advancement of Iranian nuclear enrichment beyond any civilian justification, in the deployment of American carrier strike groups to waters within striking distance of Iranian territory, in the sustained Houthi campaign against Red Sea commerce that neither American military operations nor Allied diplomatic pressure has been able to reduce to acceptable levels. The rhythm is accelerating. The question is not whether it can be heard. The question is whether the institutions with the power to change the tempo are capable of hearing it before it reaches the threshold that historical precedent identifies as the point of no return. Before we go any further, if you want the analysis that examines why this escalation is happening now, what specific forces are driving it, and what the convergence of those forces means for the global order and for your own economic conditions, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on your notifications because the escalation of the US Iran rivalry in the Persian Gulf is not a regional story with regional consequences. It is the most consequential current expression of the broader transition from a unipolar international order to a multipolar one. And understanding why it is escalating now is the prerequisite for understanding what comes next. The question this analysis addresses deserves a direct answer before the evidence is examined. Why is the US Iran rivalry escalating now at this specific moment with this specific intensity? The answer has five distinct but convergent components, each of which would be significant in isolation, and whose simultaneous activation has produced the current escalation with a force and a momentum that the routine instruments of crisis management are struggling to contain. The five components are these: the collapse of the diplomatic framework that provided the one mechanism for managed coexistence, the advancement of Iranian military and nuclear capability to thresholds that create new and urgent decision pressures on both sides, the deepening of the multipolar alliances that give Iran the strategic depth to sustain escalation without the isolation that previous American pressure campaigns could rely upon, the domestic political conditions in both Washington and Tehran that reward escalatory postures and punish the concessions that de escalation requires, and the broader structural transition of the international order that is compressing the timeline for decisions that might otherwise have been deferred. Understanding each of these components clearly is the foundation for understanding why now. And what now leads to the thesis of everything that follows is this: the current escalation of the US Iran rivalry is not the product of a single trigger or a recent miscalculation. It is the convergent product of forces that have been building across decades, that have reached a simultaneous maturation point at this specific historical moment, and that are driving the confrontation toward a threshold of irreversibility that the accumulated institutional wisdom of 4 decades of managed confrontation may not be sufficient to prevent from being crossed. Let us examine the five components of the current escalation with the precision that genuine strategic clarity requires, beginning with the collapse of the diplomatic framework, because it is the foundational event from which every subsequent component of the escalation flows. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was not merely an agreement about nuclear enrichment limits and inspection protocols. It was the one mechanism in 4 decades of US Iran confrontation that created a transactional relationship, a framework of mutual obligation and mutual benefit that gave both sides something to lose from escalation and something to gain from continued compliance. Under the JCPOA, Iran accepted rigorous inspections, accepted enrichment limits, and received in return the economic normalization and the partial reintegration into the international financial system that the sanctions campaign had denied it for decades. The IAEA certified Iranian compliance repeatedly and without reservation. The framework was working not perfectly, not comprehensively, not as a resolution of all the underlying strategic conflicts between Washington and Tehran, but as the one available mechanism for keeping those conflicts in the domain of managed competition rather than allowing them to migrate into the domain of direct confrontation. When Washington withdrew in 2018, it did not merely abandon an agreement, it dismantled the architecture of incentives that had been bending the confrontation's trajectory away from the escalation now unfolding. The Islamic Republic drew the only conclusion that the operational logic of the situation supported, that the diplomatic path offers no durable protection, that agreements with Washington are revocable instruments of convenience rather than binding security commitments, and that the only reliable guarantee of Iranian sovereignty is the deterrence capability and the regional influence network that the JCPOA had partially constrained. The acceleration of Iranian nuclear enrichment, the deepening of Russian and Chinese alliances, the intensification of proxy operations, all of these are the sequential and predictable consequences of the strategic lesson that the JCPOA collapse delivered. The current escalation is, in the most direct operational sense, the JCPOA collapse expressing itself through the strategic behavior of an adversary that has internalized its lesson completely. The second component of the current escalation is the advancement of Iranian military and nuclear capability to thresholds that create new and urgent decision pressures on both sides simultaneously. Iranian uranium enrichment has advanced to concentrations that Western intelligence agencies now describe as approaching weapons grade capability, with IAEA monitoring access restricted in ways that have compressed the early warning timeline from years to weeks and months. This compression creates a decision pressure on American and Israeli military planners that operates independently of any political decision to escalate. Because the logic of military planning in this context is that the window for preventive action against Iranian nuclear facilities narrows with each passing month of enrichment advancement, creating an institutional momentum toward preventive military action that political leaders must actively resist rather than simply choose not to activate. Simultaneously, the advancement of Iranian conventional military capability, the anti ship missile batteries, the submarine fleet, the drone and cruise missile inventory validated through proxy operations, the fast attack craft doctrine refined through years of straight harassment operations, has created a military posture whose operational confidence is reflected in the escalating boldness of Iranian challenges to American naval dominance in the Gulf. The convergence of nuclear threshold pressure and conventional capability advancement is creating a mutual escalation dynamic in which each side's rational response to the other's capability advancement produces the behavior that the other side cites as justification for its own escalatory response. This is the architecture of the spiral, and it is operating right now in real time in the waters of the Persian Gulf. The third component is the deepening of the multipolar alliances that give Iran the strategic depth to sustain escalation at a level and a duration that previous American pressure campaigns could rely upon isolation to prevent. The Russian Iranian relationship has deepened through the mutual military technology exchange, advanced air defense and electronic warfare systems flowing to Iran, proven drone technology flowing to Russia, into something that resembles a genuine strategic partnership whose institutionalization has proceeded faster and deeper than American strategic planners appear to have anticipated when they designed the simultaneous maximum pressure campaigns against both states. The Chinese Iranian relationship provides the economic oxygen, the oil purchases, the Belt and Road investment, the alternative financial infrastructure that the sanctions campaign has been unable to cut off without imposing bilateral costs on the relationship with Beijing that Washington has consistently declined to accept, and the broader network of global South relationships built through decades of Iranian positioning as a model of sovereign resistance to American coercive power, provides the diplomatic insulation that prevents the international isolation the sanctions campaign was designed to enforce. Iran is not the isolated, friendless rogue state that the official framing of maximum pressure presents. It is a state with deep, institutionalized, and operationally significant relationships with the two most capable rivals of American power, and with a global South that has concluded, through its own experience of American policy, that Iranian resistance to American coercive demands deserves strategic support rather than condemnation. This transformed strategic environment is the reason the current escalation is proceeding, with a confidence and a sustainability that previous cycles of American-Iranian confrontation did not possess on the Iranian side. The fourth component is the domestic political conditions in both Washington and Tehran that reward escalatory postures and punish the concessions that de-escalation requires, creating a political economy of confrontation that operates independently of the strategic merits of escalation and that makes the diplomatic revision required to interrupt the current trajectory politically costly in ways that the institutional architecture of both political systems is structurally disinclined to absorb. In Washington, the political system rewards toughness toward Iran and penalizes any posture that can be framed as weakness or appeasement, creating incentives for the maintenance and escalation of pressure that persist, regardless of its operational effectiveness, and that make the acknowledgement of strategic failure politically more costly than its continuation. In Tehran, the political dynamics of a revolutionary state operating under existential external pressure produce their own incentives for escalatory posture. The demonstration of resistance to American coercion serves domestic legitimation functions that give the political leadership structural incentives for confrontational behavior that go beyond the pure strategic calculus of national interest. The convergence of these domestic political incentive structures on both sides creates a political economy of escalation that operates as a powerful undercurrent beneath the surface of strategic calculation, pushing both sides toward more confrontational postures than pure strategic logic would produce, and making the political cost of the de-escalatory moves that strategic realism demands higher than the political systems of either country have demonstrated the capacity to absorb. The fifth component is the broader structural transition of the international order that is compressing the timeline for strategic decisions that might otherwise be deferred and creating the conditions under which actors on both sides of the US Iran rivalry are making choices as though time is running out. The transition from a unipolar order in which American economic and military dominance was sufficient to set the rules and enforce compliance to a multipolar order in which that dominance is contested across multiple domains simultaneously is not a gradual, linear process. It is a compression event in which the strategic calculations of every major actor are being revised simultaneously by the recognition that the distribution of power is changing faster than the institutional architecture of the international system is adapting to accommodate it. For Iran, the transition is an opportunity, the window in which the construction of deterrence capability, the deepening of multipolar alliances, and the advancement of regional influence can be completed before the American response to the transition consolidates a new containment architecture that might be more effective than the one that has failed for 4 decades. For Washington, the transition is a threat. The moment in which the failure to resolve the Iranian challenge before the multipolar order consolidates could foreclose options that are available now but might not be available. In a world in which Russian and Chinese strategic integration with Tehran has advanced to the point where military action against Iran is inseparable from military confrontation with the broader multipolar coalition, both of these temporal calculations, the Iranian urgency to consolidate before the window closes and the American urgency to act before the options foreclose, are contributing to the escalation dynamic with a force that operates beneath the level of deliberate strategic choice, and that makes the current trajectory more difficult to interrupt than a purely rational calculation of mutual interest would suggest. To understand why these five components are converging now rather than at some other point in the confrontation's long history, we must examine the historical architecture that produced the conditions of their convergence. Because the convergence is not accidental, it is the sequential product of choices that have been closing off strategic exits for 4 decades. The foundational rupture is 1953, Mossadegh, the Shah, the Savak, the revolution of 1979, as comprehensible consequence rather than unprovoked hostility. The misreading of 1979 is the original analytical error from which 4 decades of strategic miscalculation flow, including the central miscalculation that maximum pressure would produce Iranian compliance, rather than the Iranian deterrence doctrine, whose 4 decade development has now advanced to the point of genuine capability maturation that is driving component 2 of the current escalation. The 1980s deepened the strategic foundation through American provision of battlefield support to Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War, establishing the foundational Iranian strategic axiom that American security guarantees are instruments of convenience and that deterrence through demonstrated capability is the only reliable guarantee of sovereignty. That axiom has organized every subsequent Iranian strategic choice. Its 4 decade expression in the development of nuclear enrichment capability, asymmetric Gulf doctrine, and regional proxy networks is the reason the current escalation carries the momentum and the strategic depth that it does. The sequence of American strategic choices that created the conditions for the current convergence, the abandonment of the Shah without a transition strategy, the support for Saddam that made Iranian nuclear deterrence rationally necessary, the failure to convert the post-Cold War unipolar moment into a genuine regional security architecture, the Iraq invasion that destroyed the one Arab state capable of counterbalancing Iranian power, the JCPOA collapse that dismantled the one diplomatic framework capable of managing Iranian nuclear ambitions. Each of these choices closed off a strategic exit from the escalation trajectory and advanced the conditions for the convergence that is now producing the escalation, whose intensity is the subject of this analysis. The failure cascade that has produced the current escalation environment deserves its full accounting, because the scale and the sequence of the cascade is the measure of the momentum behind the escalation now unfolding. The sanctions architecture failure is the foundation of the cascade. 4 decades of progressively intensified economic warfare have produced Iranian adaptation rather than capitulation. The construction of a sanctions resistant economic infrastructure, the deepening of Russian and Chinese relationships, the development of the alternative financial architecture that has made Iran substantially more sanctions resistant at the current moment than at any previous point in the campaign's history. The weaponization of the dollar and SWIFT has simultaneously produced the de-dollarization trend that represents the most significant long-term structural consequence of the sanctions campaign, a consequence whose full economic implications are still accumulating in the form of reduced dollar reserve demand, alternative payment system development, and the progressive erosion of the monetary premium that dollar reserve currency status has provided to the American economy. The proxy containment failure compounds the sanctions failure with the operational record of every regional theater in which Iranian proxy network suppression has been attempted. Hezbollah more capable, the Houthis more capable, the popular mobilization forces institutionalized in Iraqi state structures in ways that make their removal politically impossible. The pattern is identical across every theater, and its consistent repetition has ceased to be attributable to circumstance. Iranian proxy containment efforts produce networks more capable, more institutionally embedded, and more strategically durable than the ones those efforts were designed to eliminate. The diplomatic framework destruction cascade is the most direct predecessor of the current escalation, from the JCPOA collapse through the acceleration of Iranian nuclear enrichment, from the enrichment acceleration through the compression of the preventive action window, from the window compression through the escalating military pressure that increases the likelihood of the incident driven escalation that neither side plans for, but that the architecture of prolonged confrontation in contested waters produces with a statistical regularity that honest risk management cannot dismiss. The current escalation is visible in its full dimensions across the domains where its forces are operating, and each domain's evidence compounds the overall picture of a confrontation approaching a threshold that the familiar instruments of crisis management are struggling to contain. In the nuclear domain, Iranian enrichment at historically unprecedented levels, with restricted IAEA access, is producing the decision pressure on American and Israeli military planners that operates as an independent escalatory force, an institutional momentum toward preventive action that political leadership must actively interrupt rather than simply choose not to activate. The compression of the early warning timeline from years to weeks and months is the specific mechanism through which the nuclear domain is contributing to the current escalation intensity. In the maritime domain, the sustained Iranian challenge to American naval dominance in the Strait, the harassment operations, the anti-ship missile posture, the submarine operations, the mining capability demonstration, is producing the accumulated confidence and the accumulated operational intelligence that is advancing Iranian straight denial doctrine toward the operational maturity that makes the shutdown scenario more credible and more rationally available to Iranian strategic planners than at any previous point in the confrontation's history. In the proxy domain, the Houthi Red Sea campaign is consuming American interceptor inventories at rates the industrial base cannot sustainably replenish, validating the Iranian asymmetric doctrine through operational data in real time, and demonstrating to every government watching that the cost exchange ratio of Iranian equipped asymmetric forces against American conventional naval power favors the asymmetric side with a consistency that has strategic implications extending well beyond the Red Sea theater itself. In the diplomatic domain, the fracture between the American led coalition position and the Global South's assessment of the confrontation is widening with each cycle of escalation, creating the conditions in which the international diplomatic management of a serious Gulf crisis would be less favorable to Washington than the official assumption of international solidarity suggests. The global dimensions of the current escalation extend across every axis of the emerging multipolar order, and its reverberations are reshaping international alignments with an acceleration that reflects the convergence of structural transitions rather than the linear progression of a single bilateral confrontation. China's position in the current escalation reflects the dual pressure of immediate vulnerability to Gulf energy disruption and long term strategic interest in the emergence of a multipolar Gulf order that prevents American monopoly control of the energy infrastructure on which Chinese economic security depends. Beijing's deepening of Iranian economic relationships, its development of alternative financial infrastructure, its joint naval exercises with Russia and Iran in Gulf waters, these are the institutional expression of a Chinese strategic judgment that the current American Iranian escalation trajectory poses a greater long term threat to Chinese interests through American Gulf dominance consolidation than through the Iranian deterrence capability development that the American escalation is responding to. Russia's structural alignment with Iran in the current escalation context reflects a convergence whose depth, the simultaneous application of maximum pressure to both states, has made more institutionalized and more operationally significant with each passing year. The reciprocal military technology exchange is advancing both parties' capabilities in ways that American pressure has been unable to interrupt. Russian strategic interest in Iranian success in the current escalation, in the validation of the asymmetric doctrine, in the consumption of American military resources, in the demonstration that American conventional dominance is contestable, is direct and structural rather than merely tactical. The global south is processing the current US Iran escalation as the most visible current test of the proposition that the American led international order remains the organizational framework that best serves their national interests, and the answer that the operational record of the escalation is producing, combined with the accumulated experience of American coercive policy across the global south over 4 decades, is not the answer that Washington's assumption of automatic international solidarity requires. We are standing at the twilight of the strategic approach that has organized American Iran policy since 1979. The approach premised on the conviction that sustained pressure would eventually produce the Iranian capitulation that would resolve the confrontation on American terms. The 5 components of the current escalation: the diplomatic framework collapse, the military and nuclear capability maturation, the multipolar alliance deepening, the domestic political economy of confrontation, and the structural transition compression are converging at this specific historical moment to produce a confrontation whose intensity and whose trajectory are the direct product of 4 decades of choices whose consequences have finally achieved their simultaneous maturation. The binary choice that this convergence demands is clearer and more urgent than at any previous point in the confrontation's history. The first path is genuine strategic realism, the honest acknowledgement that the 5 components of the current escalation cannot be addressed through the instruments currently being applied. That maximum pressure has produced maximum capability and maturation on the Iranian side rather than the Iranian compliance it was designed to achieve, and that the only path away from the threshold toward which the current trajectory is driving is the diplomatic engagement with the underlying strategic conditions that makes escalation both rationally necessary and politically sustainable from Tehran's perspective. This means offering Iran the verifiable security guarantees and economic normalization that might interrupt the strategic logic driving each of the 5 escalation components simultaneously, addressing the diplomatic framework void that the JCPOA collapse created, reducing the decision pressure that nuclear threshold advancement is generating, creating the positive incentives for strategic restraint that might interrupt the proxy network operational tempo, and providing the domestic political cover for de escalatory choices on both sides that the current framework of unrelenting pressure forecloses. This path is institutionally painful at a scale commensurate with the magnitude of the strategic failure it requires acknowledging, but it is the only path whose destination is not the threshold crossing that the current trajectory is approaching. The second path is the one that institutional inertia, domestic political incentives, and the accumulated momentum of 4 decades of pressure first policy have made the default. More sanctions, more carrier deployments, more covert operations, more of the approach whose consistent application has produced the 5 component convergence now driving the escalation. This path does not interrupt the escalation. It feeds it, adding the fuel of continued pressure to the fire of capability, maturation, alliance deepening, and domestic political incentives for confrontation that are already burning with a heat and a momentum, that of the familiar. Crisis management instruments are struggling to contain. Every institutional signal from Washington suggests the second path is being walked, not through deliberate choice, but through the accumulated inertia of a system that has never generated the institutional capacity, the political will, or the leadership courage to make the strategic revision that 4 decades of documented failure have made necessary. The rhythm of escalation is accelerating in the Persian Gulf. The 5 components of its current intensity are documented, specific, and convergent. The threshold toward which the current trajectory is driving is visible to anyone willing to examine the operational record without the filter of official reassurance, and the ordinary citizens whose economic conditions, energy security, and children's futures are sitting on the outcome of the strategic decisions now being made in Washington and Tehran deserve the honest accounting of why the escalation is happening now and where the path being walked leads. That is the analysis this channel exists to deliver. If it has given you a clearer and more honest picture of why the US Iran rivalry is escalating now, and what the convergence of forces driving that escalation means for the world beyond the Gulf, subscribe to this channel, turn on your notifications, and share this with someone who deserves to understand what is happening. The algorithm suppresses this kind of analysis because it disrupts the comfortable official account, and the only way it reaches the people who need it is if you carry it to them. Leave your answers in the comments below. First of the 5 components of the current escalation, examined here, the diplomatic framework collapse, the military and nuclear capability maturation, the multipolar alliance deepening, the domestic political economy of confrontation, and the structural transition compression. Which do you believe is the most consequential driver of the current escalation intensity and why? And second, given the convergence of all 5 components at this specific historical moment, do you believe the threshold of irreversibility can still be avoided? Or has the accumulation of 4 decades of strategic choices already carried the confrontation past the point where the familiar instruments of crisis management are adequate to prevent the crossing? Write your answers. The debate belongs to you.